Hey everybody, we're going to do our project on legal and ethical issues in education. Our group members consisted of Deanna Hanks, Lakeisha Franklin, Taylor Quinlan, and Jonathan Skinner. The first topic we're going to talk about is religion in public schools. The First Amendment contains two essential clauses regarding religion, the Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause. The Establishment Clause prohibits states from passing laws that show favoritism towards one religion, and the Free Exercise Clause prohibits states from interfering with those. So basically, the states must remain neutral on religious topics due to these clauses. Now, the 14th Amendment states anyone born in the United States, they are citizens, and all citizens have rights and privileges, so they must be protected. No state can deprive a citizen of life, liberty, or property without due process. So basically, the First and 14th Amendments work hand in hand to protect all citizens and the freedom of religion. Next. So some key topics: school prayer. It is unconstitutional of the state to force or encourage recitation of prayer. A moment of silence, that does not violate this. A key case in this was Santa Fe Independent School District versus Jane Doe, and it banned student-led prayer at athletic contests, graduations, and other school-sponsored events, except in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. Now, non-school sponsored events, you can have this, and obviously private voluntary student prayer is allowed. Another key topic is Bible reading. This is prohibited in public schools, but there are ways around it. The Bible can be used from a historical or literary or philosophical document perspective, so the teachers cannot just preach the Bible in class. Now, the Equal Access Act, it's important because it allows all religious groups and students to use school facilities. It must be voluntary, non-sponsored by the school, and must be before or after schools. So it's just key that all groups have this opportunity. As far as teachers, teachers have the same religious rights as everyone else, but they must not violate the Establishment Clause we talked about earlier. Teachers also may not wear religious clothing that could influence students because this would be infringing on their constitutional rights.
Okay, so now we're going to discuss freedom of expression for students. So students can participate in protests and demonstrations as long as they are peaceful, they don't violate school rules, and do not disrupt school property. School employees can regulate the protest or demonstrations. The school must tolerate minor disruptions. Next. Censorship of student newspapers. So students do have a right to express their ideas and views on school-related topics. An advisor or sponsor monitors material being produced and checks for grammatical, spelling, and appropriateness of material only. Students must follow the rules of journalism. Next. Students cannot produce material that mocks on the basis of race, origin, sex, color, or religion. Newspapers, a part of the school curriculum, is a lower risk of legal matters. Next. Censorship is inappropriate and unjust if content is not creating disruptions of the school's program and inconsistent with school's mission. A landmark case of school publications was in the Hazelwood School District. The principal prevented the publishing of a paper that profiled 3 pregnant students. The court ruled for the principal because he did not violate the freedom of speech or expression for the students. Next. Limited review of school-sponsored publications are permitted, but broad censorship is not. The Miller versus California landmark case redefined the definition of obscenity. Next. So, search and seizure. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens against unreasonable searches. There must be reasonable suspicion to initiate a search. The landmark case of New Jersey versus TLO states that schools must follow the Fourth Amendment rights, but it does not have to have a warrant. AH versus State did not meet the reasonable suspicion requirement because it was just based off the teacher's gut feeling. Next. Reasonable suspicion must be demonstrated in order to search students' social media, text messages, student desks, student lockers, student book bags, or automobiles, and strip searches need to be on an extreme circumstance basis.
Okay, due process. Due process means that fairness should be rendered in all areas. The Fifth Amendment states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Teachers must be aware of the details of their contract, be able to abide by these clauses mentioned in it, and therefore be able to live up to the employer's expectations. When I hear the word due process, it reminds me of a scenario that we worked on in the class. And I think it contained something to the nature of a teacher on her social media page. I think maybe she was wearing bikini and maybe had an alcoholic beverage in her hand, and there was
Mhm.
some inappropriate words at the bottom of her picture. And in the school district she worked in, some of those parents called for her resignation. So in this case, this will be a good example of due process. That teacher is supposed to be given the opportunity to give her side of the story before anyone decides whether she's going to resign or be fired or whatever the case may be. Okay, next. Liability and student records. Defamation involving school personnel. School personnel may face defamation charges if they are found to have communicated damaging personal information regarding a student to an unauthorized person. This particular topic also takes me back to a scenario and our discussion in our class meeting a few nights ago when we talked about particularly maybe a special education student who can only be suspended for a total of 10 days. And maybe that student got in trouble and he only had 2 days left versus where the student who he had the disagreement with may have been suspended for 5 or 10 days. So in that case, the principal cannot share with the parent um, what type of punishment the other child received or the reasoning behind what type of punishment that child received. All those parents need to know is that the situation was handled. They cannot explain another child's situation to another child or parent, if that makes sense. So that's what liability and student records take me back to. Also, with those IEPs, sometimes teachers are guilty standing in the hallway having conversations about students. That shouldn't take place as well. And we definitely shouldn't share any type of that information with another teacher or just maybe someone in the community. Okay. All right. Liability and student records continued. Definition, written defamation. Any information provided by the school personnel regarding students should be factual and pertinent to the matter being addressed. If an infraction by the student is a minor and not recurring, administration should use sound judgment in deciding whether to include it in a student's permanent file. School personnel should not make statements based on opinion, especially regarding morality, disease, family, marital conditions, and mental and emotional issues. So I like to say that things concerning student records should just basically be kept under lock and key and discussed with the proper people. Okay? Okay, you can go ahead. All right. Liability and student records. Acts of malice. Malice occurs when there is an intent to hurt another person. When information is shared regarding a student with the purpose of damaging their reputation. School personnel must be sure statements made regarding students are factual, made in good faith. Implied malice. Offender has no defense or conveying harmful information. And what comes to my mind with this is, in the past we taught students, even though we're talking about student records, but in the past we may have taught students, and when they get ready to go to another teacher's classroom, we kind of like to lay the foundation or give them the background when that's really something we shouldn't be doing, because we all know that students act different for different teachers. So I guess we should kind of try to practice giving students clean slates as they move from one teacher's classroom to the next. Okay.
Okay, individuals with disabilities, there are quite a few different acts that deal with this, but the main ones, the organization of the IDEA in 1999 and the IDEIA in 2004, it guaranteed students with disabilities the right to free, appropriate education in public schools. This allows for due process and allows each state to formalize informed policies for the due process of these students. So it requires states to allocate federal funds to children with disabilities. The first one, the major amount of funds are going to go to students that have no type of formal education. And then once those are taken care of, it will go to fund students with the most severe disabilities. It also requires each district to submit an application of how they are complying with the requirements that the IDEA specifies. So it really holds the schools accountable for their actions. The National Council on Disabilities is a federal agency that promotes programs and practices and procedures to ensure equal opportunities among individuals with disabilities, such as functional exclusion, interpretation and identification, teacher qualifications, just making sure that teachers are certified to teach the students that they're going to be teaching. And it helps with intervention, ELLs, so English language learners, and then it develops an RTI program as well as multi-tiered systems of interventions, IEP requirements, equal access, and program reviews. So the National Council just kind of backs up the IDEA on holding the schools accountable for making sure that these students are receiving the free and appropriate education that they deserve. Education Relations Services requirements requires that students are in the least restrictive environment and they're placed in a classroom with that would be the most appropriate for their level of education. In a regular classroom of inclusion is encouraged. Continuing with individuals with disabilities, disciplining students with disabilities. As mentioned before, students with disabilities are only able to be suspended for up to 10 days, but any type of discipline cannot be associated with their disability. So if their situation has occurred because of the disability, then no discipline should be taken. Individuals with Disability Education Act of 1997 addresses 3 amendments: the suspension, the manifestation, and the interim alternative education systems. So student records it has student records, it's 504 plans, individual accommodation plans for physical or mental impairment. I know in one question we had dealt with a student that that I read about was a student like broke his arm, and the parents wanted to know what the student was going to be able to, what services the student was going to be able to have. You would provide a 504 plan because the student now has a disability. When the break is healed, they would no longer have the 504 plan. But the Individuals with Disability Education Act provides those services to that student. Then the ADA Amendment Act of 2008 revised the definition of disability to cover more impairments. So it's just allowing students with disabilities an equal opportunity. The Alabama Code of Ethics is going to be a generalized plan of what educators can and cannot do ethically. So there's 8 different parts of this process. Professional conduct is just treating your colleagues with respect and support that they require or that they need. Being a trustworthy educator, you need to exemplify honesty and integrity. And it also specifics of lawful acts, unlawful acts. You need to abide by the federal, local, and state governments. Teachers are not above the law. Then teacher-student relationship, it specifically outlines what appropriate is and is not appropriate. So make sure that you are obtaining a professional relationship inside and outside of the classroom. You are not their peer, you are their educator. Alcohol, drugs, tobacco use, and possession. Teachers should refrain from ever using illegal drugs, and also tobacco use in a professional setting is not appropriate. Neither is drugs or alcohol. Public funds and property is responsible use of student and school funds. Making sure that you're using the appropriate funds allocated for appropriate situations is a teacher's top priority when dealing with funds of the school. You are to never take funds for individual use. Conduct, maintaining integrity when receiving gifts or favors. You are to never accept any favors or gifts from any outside source or interior source, like a vendor or a parent. You cannot take anything from them. Maintaining confidentiality, you have to make sure that student and personnel records are never released, and they should not be obtained by an individual that does not need to see them. You also have to make sure that individuals that are seeing them is documented at all times. Then abandonment of contract is an educator's responsibility to fulfill their contract terms for the duration of their contract. There are some instances when this is acceptable, but generally it has to be board approved. You can't just up and leave your job. So the Alabama Code of Ethics is just basically a guide that educators need to be trained on and follow to make sure that they are professional at all times. Here are the reference page that we used. We cited the textbook, the school law, and the public schools, and then we also state the purpose of the Alabama Code of Ethics.
Thank you.